The story of the court that changed everything. You want ground you can trust? Stay 6 seconds and watch a cracked court become a map. The proof is in what refuses to quit. John Kerr unlocked the community center before sunrise and stood in the doorway long enough to let the cleaner smell settle into something like intention. He turned the lights on 2 at a time, listening for the soft hum that meant the old ballasts were willing to cooperate, then toggled the scoreboard through tired digits until it remembered 0. Outside, the elevated train rubbed its steel voice against the morning, stitching blocks together with a sound nobody asked for but everyone recognized. He pinned a fresh sheet to the corkboard, "Open court restoration. Volunteers welcome," without adding please, not out of pride but because the block already knew what needed doing. He laid out cones the color of traffic warnings, stacked loaner sneakers by size with laces tucked like good intentions, and checked the first aid kit with the tenderness reserved for things that would actually be needed. Through the window the outdoor court looked like a cracked atlas, continents of asphalt pushed apart by roots and heat, lines reduced to rumor. A boy had once asked why paint mattered, and John told him lines are agreements strangers can read the same way. Paint is not decoration, it is shared grammar. He walked the perimeter in his head, and chose where primer should be heavy as patience, where the sagging fence would need a brace, where a bench could catch late winter sun. The building super stopped by with a question about the dripping sink. A teacher dropped off worn paperbacks for the reading corner. And the woman from 402 returned a borrowed wrench with a thanks that sounded like the weather finally changing. John wrote, "Today we practiced listening," above a sketch of a zone defense on the whiteboard, not as a joke, but as a plan for how to share the room. He tested a loose bolt on the bleacher and filed the edge of a splinter that had been catching sleeves, then labeled one bin use first and another fix soon so nobody would waste energy guessing order. On the radio, a low-voiced host announced a Saturday cleanup and a lost dog that answers to Benny, small notices that stitched the day to the people who would live it. He pocketed a paint chip the shade of patient blue and thought of Gianna's mural draft that treated the neighborhood like islands joined by laundry lines and fire escapes. He thought of Davi, who asked to keep the stopwatch because time behaves for the person trusted with it, and of the elders who corrected footwork with eyebrows instead of volume. A bus sighed at the curb, the bakery released a sweet warmth into air still learning daylight, and the city found its verbs again. He did not rehearse speeches for the grant committee, he rehearsed work. He arranged rollers, trays, and brushes that still shed but had fight left in them. He walked to the door, felt the key's teeth against his palm, and told the morning the sentence he saved for hard days. There are lines to draw and they will hold if hands are steady. He swung the gate open, propped it with a brick he had painted bright so nobody would stub a toe, and welcomed the first footsteps with the quiet authority of a caretaker who believes belonging is a practice. He checked the emergency flashlight and fed it fresh batteries because outages arrive at the worst moment and calm requires preparation. At the entrance he placed 2 folding chairs for elders who preferred to teach footwork with a raised brow rather than a shout. A pigeon tested the threshold and he guided it back out with the broom, amused by how quickly it respected a boundary once drawn. He wiped dust from the trophy case where a photo of an overachieving summer league leaned crooked, then straightened it with one careful finger. He practiced pulling an imaginary line across the center of the court, shoulder steady, wrist loose, breath measured, the choreography of someone who trusts craft more than luck. A neighbor stopped to ask whether the old hose bib still worked, and he admitted it leaked, drew a box around the note fix and moved on. He slid a brick under the wobbly bench, and made a second note to cut a proper shim, because temporary is brave but permanent is kinder. He checked the window that rattled in high wind and planned a brace from scrap angle iron donated by a welder who liked good causes and quiet work. He counted ball pumps and needles, then taped the drawer labeled lost and found and sorted its contents into a row that made sense to everyone who would come looking. He returned to the doorway, wiped the handprint he had left on the glass with the sleeve of his hoodie, and smiled at the evidence that caretaking leaves of the caretaker. By noon the gym recovered its native language. Sneaker squeaks, ball thumps, laughter ricocheting in patterns that meant rules were working. Davi clipped the stopwatch to his pocket and stood taller by a fraction only the patient would notice. The twins performed a solemn comedy over scoreboard duty that ended in a fair rotation. Gianna unfurled tubes and showed the east wall as a horizon deep enough to keep future storms without drowning the street. The grant committee arrived with clipboards and sensible shoes, and John let the room speak before he did. He pointed to verbs, not needs: replace sand, seal, repaint, invite. He showed the taped rectangle that marked the reading corner, the shelf of disinfectant and donated socks, the chart that sped up loaner shoes. He did not hide the broken geography outside. He narrated the plan like a spine. They asked about supervision after dark, about lights, about weekends. He answered with names, schedules, and the grandmother who knitted hats near the door as a kind of security system that smelled like soap. A delivery driver slid cones aside for a truck and waved without waiting for thanks. A small proof that work already had gravity. Kids explained drills better than any adult could, and the committee wrote notes that looked less like doubt and more like inventory. When the clipboards left promising a decision by evening, John refused to count minutes. He built the afternoon like a staircase that respected breath. Tutoring at 3, open gym at 5, residence at 7 in a long room where every chair wobbled and still carried the weight of a meeting. He called the fence guy above the bakery, left a message with the paint store that saved mistint cans for community projects, and texted a neighbor whose ladder came with the price of strong coffee. The rent letter rode in his pocket like a stubborn stone. He folded it once into a straightedge to align pencils on the homework table, because dignity hides in such alignments. Outside, a child drew a hopscotch grid that outlived rain. Marigolds shouldered exhaust, and a song on the radio lent the afternoon a bassline sturdy enough to hang worry on. He checked tools, counted rollers, labeled one sack use first and another repair, and wrote ask for ice packs at the clinic on a sticky note. He returned a lost library card to a girl who had left it tucked in a mystery novel, and her relief flashed bright enough to be stored for later. He measured shade along the fence and pictured the first straight pull of white across gray. A breath held on the downstroke and released when the line declared itself. He watched the doorway as neighbors came to sign the volunteer list, each name an agreement, each time slot a promise put where it could be seen. He left space for doubt, and then built something in it. He breathed through the center of the day until it softened. He walked the block to study how traffic breathed at different hours, and decided which cones could be spared for safety without starving drills inside. He answered a text from a teenager begging for a heavier ball because it bounced straighter. According to a physics he refused to argue with, because belief is part of flight. He borrowed a measuring tape from the corner mechanic and chalked distances in modest, exact numbers, honoring the kind of precision that keeps arguments short and games long. He sketched a schedule that left room for late buses and surprise homework, the real weather of after-school hours. When rain threatened, he wrote Plan B along the margin, and underlined move chairs inside twice. He compared 2 brands of tape, tore strips with his teeth, and learned by touch which adhesive would not surrender when the night turned humid. He checked the breaker box, labeled each switch properly at last, and left a small diagram inside the door for whoever needed it at a bad hour. He took a photo of the cracked sideline, not for social media but for the hardware clerk who always asked for context before recommending supplies. He listened to the hollow under one patch of asphalt, and added a bag of cold patch to the list, then laughed when a kid asked whether cold patch was a kind of ice cream. He kept laughter in the room as a tool, not a distraction. Evening leaned against the block and the gym answered with warm lamps and talk braided from entrance to baseline. Parents traded shifts and recipes and the names of teachers who learned siblings before grades. Kids drifted back after dinner, pulled by rumor that news had landed. John poured lemonade sweeter than the instructions and pretended not to watch his phone. At 6:19 the buzz came, at 6:20 another. He read once, closed his eyes to make room for gratitude, and said the word the room had been rehearsing all day. Approved. The sound moved like light turning a corner. Gianna hugged her drawings and laughed into paper. The twins sealed a temporary truce with a high five and promptly resumed their argument about blue, now a matter of policy. Elders nodded once, the long vote of people who have seen funds arrive and vanish, and still show up tomorrow. Inside him the switchboard flipped to action. He called the fence guy, messaged the paint store, scheduled ladders and rollers, promised Sunday photos to keep momentum. He slid the rent letter into a folder labeled later, and decided to meet later prepared. When the gym emptied and the lights dropped to a softer hum, he locked up and walked to the battered court alone. Under sodium light, the cracks looked less like failures and more like instructions. He stood at the baseline and spoke names from the logbook, letting each ring once in the open air. He launched a paper plane folded from an old form and watched it glide a clean arc and rest. He set alarms titled paint, fence, water, and one more titled rest to keep tomorrow honest. He called his mother just to hear pride bend his name upward at the end. He carried that sound home like a key. On the walk he passed the laundromat's clean heat and the bakery's sugar, a duet that never tries to be pretty and therefore is. He paused at a wall that used to host bad news and now wore a rectangle of fresh color. A quiet win that only a careful eye would count. Saturday came with a small parade. Gloves, caps, water bottles, willingness. Rollers swallowed primer and came up shining. A man produced a drill. Another showed with 5 meters of wire, and the knitting grandmother arrived with empanadas that survived exactly half the shift. The fence stood straighter, the splinters surrendered, the first center stripe declared itself without wobble, and the ball's first bounce returned a sound that felt like agreement. Near sunset they stepped back together, and nobody spoke for a count of 3. John pressed one palm to the new line as if reading Braille for the future. He taped a fresh list of next tasks, wrote thank you notes by name, and set the broom in its corner like a flag instead of an afterthought. He finally let himself imagine a season of games that ended in handshakes and chores shared out loud. He walked home under a sky the color of cooled steel, tired in the right way, and slept with paint chips fanned on the table like a small map of what comes next. After the crowd dispersed, he walked the new lines again with a slow, pleased disbelief, like a reader tracing a favorite sentence. He gathered stray cups, broke down boxes for recycling, and swept until the broom bristles sang that soft, satisfying rasp across clean concrete. He checked the padlock twice, then a third time, and dropped the keys into the same pocket where the rent letter had lived, noticing how different weight could feel. He turned once more to look and caught his own reflection in the dark glass. Shoulders relaxed, mouth easy, a man whose day had answered back. He promised himself to write the week's names on a sheet and tape it where sun would catch them, because gratitude does not work if kept secret. He drafted a message to the committee with one photo only, the first crisp stripe, and a line that read your funds met their purpose. He allowed the tired to arrive without apology and the hope to stay without permission. On Sunday morning he returned early and found chalk drawings already multiplying across the adjacent sidewalk. Crowns, stars, a clumsy heart, a square labeled home. He looked up at the tracks and listened to a train pass, a silver sentence sliding overhead, and thought that maybe the city had been practicing this cadence with him all along. He set the cones aside for the first scrimmage and for once, sat on the bench and let the room take care of him for exactly 1 minute.